Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Today we will talk about the physiology of the female reproductive system. The female reproductive system main function is either to prepare the body to conceive a baby, or the second function, which is to take care of the baby while it is being developed. So it is during a pregnancy. So the first part, or the first function we will talk about in this lecture, which is chapter 82 from your textbook Guyton. The main objectives of from this lecture is first to identify the hormones of female reproduction and describe their physiological actions. Second, to describe the changes that occur in the ovaries during every month. Then describe the hormonal control of the developing follicles, ovarian follicles, which contain the ovum, and the stages of ovulatory cycle. Then recognize the pituitary ovarian axis and recognize the regulation of the ovarian cycle leading to ovulation. The main physiological parts or organs of the female reproductive system is first the gonads of the female, which are the two ovaries. So ovaries are the first or the primary organ of the female reproductive system, in which an ovum will be produced, at least one ovum produced every month, that is going to be expelled from the ovaries into the abdomen and be taken up by the fallopian tubule and fallopian tube, and then will be transported along the fallopian tube. And then if it was fertilized, the zygote will be implanted in an organ that is called uterus. And this ovum, fertilized ovum, will grow as a fetus in the uterus until it's ready to be delivered through the cervix of the uterus at the end of pregnancy and the exterior vaginal organ. So these are the main parts of the female reproductive system. After puberty, in the normal years of reproductive function in the females, there will be monthly rhythmical changes in the rates of secretion of female hormones, and they correspond to physical changes that take place in the ovaries and in the other reproductive organs. And these rhythmical changes are recognized by the monthly menstrual cycle, which can be more accurately described as monthly female sexual cycle. There is another type of cycle, which is the ovarian cycle, which are changes that take place according to different stages of development of the ovum in the ovaries. The duration of the cycle, the average is about 28 days, but the range is between 20 to 45 days. There are two results of the female sexual cycle. The first result is release of a single ovum from the ovaries every month. And the second action or result is preparing the endometrium for implanting the fertilized ovum. One of the main functions of the female reproductive system is to produce an ovum every month. to be fertilized by the sperm. So oogenesis is a series of steps that involve the development and differentiation of an immature egg, which is called oocyte, into a mature egg, which is called ovum, through a series of steps. That's what we refer to as oogenesis. So let's start at the beginning. In the early embryonic life, primordial germ cells that originated from the yolk sac will migrate to the outer surface of the ovary and then will start proliferating very repetitively, and then they reach the cortex substance of the ovaries. And at this stage, we call them oogonia or oogonium, and another name, primordial ovum. These cells will collect a layer of ovaries stromal cells, and those cells will look like epithelioid cells, and it's called a granulosa layer or granulosa cells. Then we call this a primordial follicle. إذن هي الآن صارت حويصلة. It's not only an ovum. Then the primordial follicle is actually considered an immature primary oocyte. Okay, so in other words, it's called primary follicle when these layers are increased in number and thickness. So at birth, we will have a primary oocyte that is completed mitosis. So proliferation now is ceased, and it enters the first stage of meiosis and then a rest. And that actually takes place by the 5th month of gestation, so that at birth the baby will have about 1 to 2 million oocytes, fixed number. It's not gonna increase or proliferate. A female is born with fixed number of oocytes. The range is about from 1 to 2 million oocytes, arrested in the prophase of meiosis 1. And the genetic material in these primary oocytes is that they have 46 chromosomes, so those are diploid. Now, after puberty, each month, those primary oocytes will develop and will go further into the meiosis 1 to produce one secondary oocyte, which has a haploid chromosomes, 23, and a smaller cell, which is called the first polar body, which will degenerate eventually. And after that, the secondary oocyte will not undergo the second phase of meiosis until fertilization takes place. So on the other side here, the stages of the primordial follicle to primary follicle, and then stages of ovulation that we will talk about later in the ovarian and ovulatory cycle. you will see that primary follicle will become mature, okay, and that's what we call pre-ovulatory follicle, when it builds and secretes fluids inside the follicle, and then we will have different layers of cells that we call theca. And then after that, ovulation is going to take place when the ovum is expelled out of this follicle into the abdomen in order to be taken by the fimbriae of the fallopian tube. And the expelled egg actually is a secondary oocyte that is arrested in the metaphase of meiosis II. So only after being fertilized by the sperm, it will finish up the meiosis II, and then it will produce an ovum, which is now a zygote, and a second polar body, which also will degenerate. About the regulation of ovarian function. How are the ovarian function is regulated? There are three hierarchies of hormonal systems that are there in the regulating the ovarian function, similar to what we have seen in the male reproductive system. The first hormone is the hypothalamic releasing hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone. That is, once is stimulated and released, it will activate the anterior pituitary 6 hormones secretion, which are the gonadotropic hormones, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is the luteinizing hormone. Without secretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone, there will be no secretion of FSH and LH, and that's what happens during childhood. The ovaries remain inactive because of the absence of the gonadotropic releasing hormone as well as FSH and LH. And after puberty, when the gonadotropic releasing hormone is secreted, then LH and FSH will be released, stimulated from the anterior pituitary hormone. Then the ovaries will start functioning. Third hormones are the ovarian hormones, which are stimulated by both LH and FSH, which are estrogen and progesterone, which are parallel to testosterone in the male reproductive system. Now, all the ovarian changes that take place during the sexual cycle of a female every month depend completely on the FSH and LH rhythmical secretions by the anterior pituitary gland. So both FSH and LH stimulate ovarian target cells that we will talk about later by binding to specific receptors and then modulating the rates of secretion, growth, and proliferation in these cells, and thus modulating the ovarian function. The ovarian cycle, monthly cycle, is composed of two main phases, which are the follicular phase, in other terms, pre-ovulatory phase, and the second phase is the luteal phase, which is also called post-ovulatory phase. And in the middle, we have the event of ovulation. In the first phase, which is the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, we will have an ovum, and that's during childhood, that is surrounded by a single granulosa cell, which is called the primordial follicle, as we mentioned earlier. And these cells provide nourishment for the ovum and also secrete a substance called oocyte maturation inhibiting factor, which keeps the ovum in the primordial state. After puberty, which takes place around from 11 to 13 years old in females, when the anterior pituitary gland secretes follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone due to the gonadotropic releasing hormone stimulus, then the ovum will increase in size and growth, and there will be additional layers of the granulosa cell, and then these follicles will be called primary follicles. In this figure, there is a demonstration for the different stages of follicular development. And as you can see here, this is the primordial follicle, where we will have the primary oocyte, and then it will be surrounded by the granulosa cells, which will increase in the number of layers. And then the interstitium of the ovary will build another group of cells that are called theca cells outside the granulosa cells to form a second mass of cells that are called theca. And this theca is divided into two layers, the theca interna and theca externa. Indeed, the cyclical changes in the rates of secretion of both anterior pituitary hormones FSH and LH will affect the growth and development of the ovarian follicles. For example, during the first few days of the monthly female sexual cycle, during the first 2 weeks, there will be an increase of the secretion of FSH in the red line and LH in the blue line, which actually we will have slightly more FSH than LH. And this results in an acceleration of the growth of many primary follicles each month. So as we can see here in this schematic, during follicular phase, the gonadotropic releasing hormone will induce secretion of both FSH and LH, as we mentioned, with slightly more FSH than LH. Then FSH will have a positive effect on the granulosa cells to secrete estrogen, as they have the aromatase enzyme necessary for this production. Also, LH will stimulate thecal cells in the follicle, surrounding the follicles, to produce androgens, which can further be converted in the granulosa cells after they diffuse into the granulosa cells into more estrogens. In this figure, you will see the levels of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone during the different stages of the ovarian cycle, as well as the levels of both estradiol and progesterone also during the different stages of ovulatory cycle. Now let's focus on the first phase of the ovulatory cycle, which is the pre-ovulatory phase or the follicular phase. It begins after menstruation. As you can see here, during menstruation, which starts at day 0 of the ovulatory cycle, the female sexual cycle, the levels of estrogen and progesterone are very low, almost 0. At this stage, we will see increasing levels of both FSH and LH, having slightly more FSH secretion rate than LH. And this is mainly due to the absence of the negative feedback of estrogen, mainly on the anterior pituitary hormone, due to the low level of estrogen. However, you will see that with the increasing levels of SH, FSH, and LH, granulosa cells will start secreting more of the estrogen. So there will be an increase, a peak, as you can see here, of estradiol during the first 2 weeks. That will be accompanied with reduction of FSH and LH. And that goes with the inhibitory negative feedback effect of estrogen on the anterior pituitary hormones FSH and LH. So this is actually makes sense that estrogen have a negative feedback on the gonadotropic hormones. However, just before ovulation, we will have a surge in the LH hormone as well as the FSH hormone to a lesser extent. That is accompanied by increase in the progesterone secretion and reduction in the estrogen secretion, which we will talk about when we talk about the ovulatory phase. And this is contradictory to what we know about the negative feedback effect of estradiol. So it is a characteristics of the female ovarian reproductive cycle that there is contradicting effects of estrogen due to different stages of the ovarian cycle. Estrogen hormones in non-pregnant women are mainly synthesized from the ovaries and more specifically from the granulosa cells, as they have got the aromatase enzyme that is necessary for the production of the different forms of estrogens, which differ in either potency or in the availability, having the beta estradiol as the primary and the major estrogen that is present in the female, non-pregnant female, as well as the estrone, which is also present in lesser amount, but with also potency that is relative to the estradiol. Estradiol is more potent than the estrone for 12 times. The estriol is the less potent of all, which is 1/80 potency compared to estradiol. Now, all of these forms are produced from cholesterol and from different androgens, testosterone, progesterone, and you will have also dehydroepiandrosterone and androstenedione. As I said, in non-pregnant female, they originate from the ovaries. However, in pregnant female, estrogens can be produced from the placenta. After a few days of proliferation and growth of the primary follicles, the granulosa cells will start secreting follicular fluids that contain high concentrations of estrogen, and this fluid will accumulate to form the antrum, and this is what we call the antral follicle. And this antrum is surrounded by the granulosa cells that secretes this fluid. The early growth of the primary follicles and reaching the antral stage or antral follicle is under the follicle stimulating hormone only, which is characterized in the first stage or first phase of the ovarian cycle. Then there will be accelerated growth of the follicle to a larger follicle that is called vesicular follicle or Graafian follicle. And this accelerated growth is caused by the estrogen that is secreted into the follicle, which will induce the granulosa cells themselves to increase the FSH receptors, which will cause a positive feedback effect on the granulosa cells to increase more estrogen secretions. In addition, both estrogen and FSH, they have synergistic effects in promoting LH receptors on the granulosa cells. So in addition to the FSH stimulation, there will be LH stimulation. And this will cause a rapid increase in the follicular secretion. Finally, the increasing estrogen secretion from the follicle plus increasing LH from the anterior pituitary gland together will cause or induce proliferation of the thecal cells and increasing their secretion of androgens. In this schematic, all these interactions between thecal and granulosa cells, as well as the effect of the LH and FSH hormones, are demonstrated in this scheme. As you can see here, the granulosa cell have FSH receptors as well as LH receptors, which will induce granulosa cells by increasing cyclic AMP mainly to increase synthesis of estrogen. In the thecal cells, LH hormone will also bind to cell membrane receptors to induce the second messenger cyclic AMP to produce androgens. Androgens can diffuse from the theca cells to granulosa cells, where by aromatase can be further contribute to the estrogen secreted from the granulosa cells. Now the antral follicles will begin to grow and increase, enlarge, and the ovum will be embedded, as you can see here in this figure, at one pole of the granulosa cells of the follicle. and this is what we call the pre-ovulatory mature follicle. We have a large antrum here and the ovum at one pole of the granulosa cells. During all the reproductive years of a female adult, and between 13 to 46 years of age, which is the reproductive age of most women, there will be 400 to 500 primordial follicles, and these will be developed during this time, during these years, to expel their ova, one each month. So from the 1 to 2 millions primary oocytes or oogonium in the female baby, there will be only 400 to 500 that will succeed to be ovulated. The rest are going to be disintegrate or undergo a condition that is called atresia or involution. Now let's start talking about the event occurring after completion of the maturation of the follicle. There will be a time where the ovum will be expelled from the mature Graafian follicle, which is called ovulation. For this event, luteinizing hormone is the necessary for this event, for the final follicular growth and ovulation. So failure of secreting luteinizing hormone or absence of LH will lead to failure of ovulation, even if growth of the follicle was going very well. So 2 days before ovulation, the rate of LH will increase significantly and peak 16 hours before ovulation. As you can see here, LH hormone peaks just before ovulation, just 2 days before ovulation. Also, FSH increases up to 2 or 3-fold and acts synergistically with LH. As you can see here in the graph, LH, this is the LH surge, which we call LH surge. The increase of about 16-fold, 8 to 16-fold of LH is accompanied by an increase in FSH, which is about 4 to 6-fold increase. And this actually will cause a swelling of the follicle just before ovulation. And that takes place about 16 hours before ovulation. The main function of LH is to act on the granulosa cells and the thecal cells, converting them to produce more progesterone. And then we will see that estrogen secretion will decrease about 1 day before ovulation, while progesterone secretion will begin to increase. These effects are clearly demonstrated in these figures, where we have FSH and LH levels during the different phases of ovulation, as well as estradiol levels in the upper graph and progesterone. As you can see here, just before ovulation, LH surge is accompanied with reduction of estrogen levels and increase in the progesterone levels. After the LH surge, there will be increase and rapid secretion of progesterone from the follicle, as we mentioned. Then, few hours later, 2 events will take place that are necessary for ovulation. The first event the theca externa will begin to secrete proteolytic enzymes that will weaken the wall of the follicle, resulting in swelling and degeneration of a structure called stigma on the follicular wall, which is a protrusion, small protrusion of the follicular wall. Then there will be a rapid growth of new blood vessels into the follicle and release of prostaglandins, which will be secreted into the follicular tissue. So after these events, ovulation will start. So from this chart, you will see that luteinizing hormone is the hormone that is responsible for initiating the ovulation process by increasing synthesis of progesterone by the granulosa and thecal cells. And after that, you will see increase in the production of proteolytic enzymes, such as collagenase, as well as the hyperemia, the increased vascularization, and prostaglandin secretion. The event of proteolytic enzymes will weaken the follicle wall and will cause degeneration of the stigma, the protrusion on the follicular wall, which will help rupturing the follicle. In addition, the prostaglandin secretion will signal to the follicle to undergo swelling, more or further swelling, which will enhance and stimulate the rupture of the follicle, and then the evagination or expelling of the ovum. So ovulation process takes place 14 days after the onset of menstruation if the female sexual cycle was 28 days. So as we mentioned, during ovulation, the stigma will protrude further, and then fluids will go outside from the follicle, and then this will cause rupture of the stigma, causing viscous fluid. As you can see here in this figure, the fluids inside the antrum will be expelled, carrying with it the ovum. And at this stage, the ovum is surrounded by a mass of a granulosa cell that is called corona radiata. So corona radiata is exactly the same as the granulosa cells. So this is a bigger shot of the expelled ovum. You will see the corona radiata. Part of the granulosa cells will be expelled with the ovum, and we have a layer of zona pellucida, and then surrounding the ovum, and the nucleus, as you can see here inside the ovum. Now, after expelling the ovum during ovulation, the remaining granulosa cells with the thecal cells will be called corpus luteum. This structure is called a corpus luteum. And this structure will be in around 7 to 8 days after ovulation, will be around 1.5 centimeter in diameter. So it will be increased in the large at first. One of the methods to identify the day of ovulation of the female sexual cycle is to measure body temperature among the ovarian cycle. So secretion of progesterone actually after ovulation is accompanied with a raise in body temperature of about 0.5 Fahrenheit. And this actually is going to be an abrupt increase in the body temperature, which may indicate the occurrence of ovulation, and this is a method used by women to identify the ovulation day for conceiving purposes. And that is the characteristic of the second phase of the ovarian cycle, which is called the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So the theca interna and the granulosa cells will change into lutein cells, which become filled with lipid inclusions, which will give them a yellowish appearance. So the granulosa cells in this corpus luteum structure will form large amount of both progesterone and estrogen. However, the theca cells will mainly form androgens, which can be converted by the granulosa cells into female hormones or estrogen. And in this schematic representing the luteal phase, both LH and FSH will have a positive effect on the corpus luteum to secrete estrogen, progesterone, as well as an inhibitory factor that is called inhibin. And all of these will have a negative feedback loop on both the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, inhibiting both gonadotropin releasing hormone and anterior pituitary hormones, the gonadotropins FSH and LH. So this is a characteristic, a very important characteristic of the luteal phase, which is the inhibition of FSH and LH and gonadotropic releasing hormone by the secreted estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin from the corpus luteum. And this is demonstrated here, as you can see here. After ovulation, levels of LH and FSH will decrease significantly, while levels of progesterone and estrogens will increase due to the, of course, the corpus luteum secretion of these substances. The luteinizing hormone is called so because of the luteinizing function of LH. So LH will make the ovum extruded from the follicle. Then it will also change the granulosa and theca interna into the lutein cells, as well as promoting the secretion of progesterone and estrogen from the corpus luteum. Now, if pregnancy occurred, then the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone will act similarly to LH, to the luteinizing hormone, which is the HCG secreted from the placenta. So it will act on the corpus luteum to promote excretion of progesterone and estrogen and prolong the life of the corpus luteum for more 2 to 4 months of pregnancy. However, if fertilization failed to occur, then a pregnancy will not take place and corpus luteum will involute. Then the onset of the next ovarian cycle will begin. And that's because estrogen and progesterone from the corpus luteum, they have very strong negative feedback effect on the anterior pituitary gland and inhibit the secretion of SH and LH at the end of the cycle. Furthermore, lutein cells secrete small amounts of a hormone that is called inhibin, an inhibitory hormone, that inhibit the secretion of FSH by the anterior pituitary gland. So this will cause reduction of both FSH and LH, as well as loss of these hormones. Then loss of these hormones will cause degeneration of the corpus luteum, which is called involution of the corpus luteum. So around the 26th day of the normal female sexual cycle, and after involution of the corpus luteum, there will be a sudden cessation of estrogen and progesterone, as well as inhibin, which will remove the negative feedback inhibition of the anterior pituitary gland, and then it will allow increased secretion of FSH and LH again. And that is a characteristic of the beginning of a new ovarian cycle.